Okay, we're recording. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our SNATS chat for fall 2019. As many of you know, NATS has had a lot of great success with their NATS chats for years, and we're really excited to be presenting this forum aimed specifically at SNATS members, current students, and emerging professional voice teachers with topics geared specifically to that group. If you've missed any of our previous SNATS chats, they're archived on the NATS website on the SNATS section. If you've got ideas for future SNATS chats, future topics that you think would be good for this forum, I'm putting my email address in the chat window. It's eric.hood@usu.edu. You can send those ideas to that website, and we will consider them for future SNATS chats. So the way this evening is going to work is I'll introduce our guest. He'll give a presentation on our topic, which is what do voice teachers really need to know about voice science? And afterwards, we'll have some time for questions from those of you who are attending. Save your questions until the end of the presentation. I guarantee you that many of them will be answered, and you might find you have follow-ups that come from later on in the presentation. So hold on to them until we finish up, and then we'll address them. Once the presentation's over, you can ask questions either by raising your hand, and I can unmute your microphone, and you can ask our guest yourself, or you can send me the question via text, and I will ask that to Scott when we finish his presentation. So with all that being said, it's my privilege to introduce our guest this evening. Our guest is one of my mentors from my doctoral studies, and to be honest, one of the main reasons I am teaching in higher education today, Dr. Scott McCoy. Just a brief bio of our guest. Dr. McCoy is a noted singer, conductor, and pianist with extensive performance experience in concert and opera. He is professor of voice and pedagogy and director of the Swank Voice Lab at The Ohio State University. His voice science and pedagogy textbook, Your Voice and Inside View, is used extensively by colleges and universities throughout the US and abroad, and it's out now in a third edition, available now at Inside View Press. And he is also associate editor of the Journal of Singing and the past president of NATS. And an all-around fantastic voice teacher and singer and guy. And so welcome, Scott. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Eric. I'm really excited to be here tonight. So our topic tonight is what do emerging voice teachers really need to know about voice science? And I will give a disclaimer at the outset of this talk. This is not a talk that is geared toward teaching you what I think you need to know about voice science. This is more something that is designed to really spur some thought on your part and to really think about the interrelationships of all the huge number of things that we need to understand and know about as singing teachers. One of those is certainly voice science. So we're going to start with this question: what do we really need to know about voice science? And we'll look at a couple of different possible answers. Okay, and why won't that do it? The first one, what do we need to know? Absolutely nothing. I mean, after all, generations of teachers and singers going back millennia sang beautifully and efficiently without knowing anything about voice science. They taught from experience. They taught from what sounds good. They taught from what worked best in the theater, what worked best in the church, what worked best when they were just out singing with friends. And they didn't really feel the need to know about the cricothyroid muscle or any of that kind of stuff that we sort of fixate on right now. So we still do have an awful lot of teachers who unfortunately know absolutely nothing about voice science. Some of them do it intentionally. Some of them do it simply out of ignorance of knowing that there is something that they could learn. And because of that, we get a lot of teachers who are teaching alternative truths and really a post-truth, sort of like our political scene right now. Let's see about a different answer. Answer 2. Well, we should probably know as much as is possible. And after all, voice science has provided a huge body of essential information. Contemporary teachers really must know the name, function, innervation, and blood supply of every physical structure related to singing. I mean, how could you possibly call yourself a voice teacher if you don't understand the course and the function of the recurrent laryngeal nerve? you clearly would be lacking something. So we also need to have a knowledge of voice resonance, which must be 100% factual and thorough. I mean, I would expect to just be able to throw out a question and say, okay, let's say somebody is singing the pitch C5 on the vowel O. Which of the first 4 harmonics is going to be strongest? And you ought to be able to answer that just off the top of your head. And of course, in this system, all use of imagery and suggestion are forbidden. The focus must never deviate from scientifically proven methods and techniques. And fortunately, this can now even extend to musicianship. Scientists have been working for years at algorithms that are able to change just a completely surgically dry recording made by synthesizers and teach it to be musical so that it has retards in the right places and crescendos. So pretty soon it might not even need us at all. Now, answer 2 is also unreasonable, because if we're really going to know as much as possible about voice science, that's going to make us somebody like Johann Sundberg, who you see right now, or perhaps Ingo Tietze, who are absolutely brilliant singer-scientists. Between the two of them, I can't imagine a brain trust who knows anywhere close to what these two gentlemen know about the voice. But does that knowledge of the voice turn them into credible vocal artists? Could either of them sing at the Metropolitan Opera in their prime? Probably not. And realistically, they both sing okay. And their knowledge of science was insufficient by itself to turn them into great singers. And we need to understand this, that science helps us make noise. But as singers, we use that noise to make music. And as singing teachers, we have to do 2 things. We have to teach our students how to make noise, and then we have to teach them how to make music out of that noise. We got a lot of work to do. Let's try another answer. Number 3. Here's the simple version of number 3. Enough not to say or do something stupid. Yeah, that seems kind of maybe a little bit too flippant, but it's actually correct. I can't tell you the number of times I have gone to master classes, or I have been in studios observing teachers for evaluations of some sort, or even the students who are doing their practice teaching with me after they have already had their voice science instruction and their methods instruction. And they still say things that are just plain stupid. So, better version of the answer. Enough to assist your process of diagnosis and instruction as you pursue beautiful artistic singing. My contention is that there is absolutely no point in knowing voice science for its own sake, unless you are an academic who is studying the art of singing and not studying how to sing. As singers, we're not worth anything if we can't make it beautiful and artistic. And as teachers, one of our jobs is to teach students as effectively and efficiently as possible. My philosophy is that most of us as teachers should be able to induce pretty significant changes and differences in vocal quality in a relatively short period of time. And the more efficient we become, and the more we are able to apply what we know about science to accelerate our teaching techniques by letting us zero in on what we need to do specifically, rather than saying, okay, I hear something, let's start trying different things and see if it cracks it. Instead, you're going to develop your ears so that you don't even need to look at your singer. You can just listen to that person and identify in the sound a quality that indicates that the tongue is tight, or the jaw is tight, or the breath is overpressured, or that the resonance is simply way out of whack, making it so that the singer cannot sing in tune or with a consistent scale from all parts of the voice. So we got a lot of stuff to do. But the problem is, There's a lot of other stuff that we have to know. Let's think about what singing teachers need to know compared to some other teachers of music. As a singing teacher, we need to know voice repertoire. But let's think about that by itself. If you are a singing teacher and you are a soprano, the odds are you are also going to be teaching mezzos, altos, tenors, baritones, bass baritones, and basses. And with each of those types, you are going to have different voice subsets. Some are going to be lyrics, some are going to be coloratura, some are going to be soubrette, some are actually going to be dramatic, although you might not have a real one of those, but once or twice during your teaching life. And we need to know repertoire that represents all of those different voice types. We need to know how physiology differs between those different voice types. And then there's the question of repertoire. How many of you are familiar with the songs of Schubert? I hope most of you nodded in agreement that you know the songs of Schubert. Well, do you know every song in Die schöne Müllerin? Some of you do. More of you don't. Do you know every song in Winterreise? Or Dichterliebe or Frauenliebe und Leben? Probably more of you know Frauenliebe und Leben. Or the Liederkreis? Or heaven forbid something like Brahms' Die schöne Magalone. Great, big, monstrous song cycle. But even without the song cycles, we have over 600 Schubert songs. How many of you know all of the Donizetti operas or all of the Verdi operas? No, we don't. There's just too much for us to know everything. And then when we add the millennia of choral music that we have, which often features solo voices, but which also demand a high level of vocalism, we see that the amount of repertoire that we could know is nearly impossible to even scratch the surface. Now, compare that to your friend who's a saxophone player. There's a good chance that if you do 3 degrees in saxophone, a bachelor's, master's, and doctorate, by the time you finish, you will have played most of the primary works for that instrument. But as a singer, you're going to do all of your recitals and you will barely have scratched the surface. We need to know languages. When your pianist friend plays a Debussy piece on the piano, he doesn't need to play it in French. He needs to play it in French style, just like we do. We need to sing it with the appropriate French style. But we've got to sing the blasted words. And remember all those wonderful diction rules in French, which seem to change on alternate Thursdays for specific words. And then dramatic expression. We need to know how to sell that text and deport ourselves on stage. We would probably be annoyed if a pianist or a trumpeter did the kind of things to express the text that we need to do. So there's a lot of other stuff. We'll talk some more about that in a little bit. So a lot of that other stuff. So let's start off with a test. This is your anatomy and physiology test. It's going to be brief and very easy. I think there are only 3 questions. Here's the first. Which muscles are responsible for closing the posterior of the glottis? Got that? Okay. Can everybody agree that it is what? What does that say? The intra-arytenoid is not the posterior cricoarytenoid. That's an abductor. We need the intra-arytenoids, adductor muscles, correct? And the lateral cricoarytenoids. So, see, saying something stupid isn't just something that happens out of ignorance. Accidents happen. And sometimes we say something stupid because what used to be true isn't anymore. How'd you do on that one? Which muscles help protect the ears from sounds that are too loud? Anybody have an idea about this one? Did you even realize that we have ear muscles? Well, we do. The tensor tympanum and the stapedius muscles are in there to contract when we are exposed to very loud noise, so that the 3 little bones of the ossicular chain, or the ossicles, transmit less mechanical vibration to the inner ear, and that helps to preserve our hearing. And I'll bet some of you have experienced the tensor tympanum and the stapedius doing their work. Have you ever gone to a loud concert or been someplace where it was just plain noisy? And you're there for quite a while, and then when you leave, the world seems muffled to you? Well, that is because those two muscles are still locking down your ossicles. But unfortunately, they fail way too often, and eventually sound level just plain overcomes what they can attenuate. Okay, last one. What nerve innervates the diaphragm? Do you all know this? Well, it is, of course, the phrenic nerve. Well, why in the world would that be important? Well, it used to be important for singing teachers because of the false belief that the phrenic nerve was also the source of the nerves that branched off to serve the larynx. But in reality, those nerves come from the vagus nerve, not the phrenic nerve. So it was wishful thinking the whole time. But what do we really need to know? And I'll bet most of you are familiar with diagrams like the one that's on the screen right now. A great diagram where we have got, about 30 different things that are highlighted and arrows going every which way, and everything is too little for you to really see. And, that makes it tough. It makes us think off the top of our heads or immediately that this is going to be more complicated than we can do. So we just break it down. But what do we really know? What do we need to know? Do we really need to know the names, locations, and functions of primary respiratory muscles and symptoms of dysfunction? Well, I would suspect that an awful lot of you would agree with that. We need to know the diaphragm, of course, the internal and external intercostals, the abdominal muscles with the rectus and the external and internal obliques, the transverse, and that good old quadratus lumborum down there. And some people also thinking about the psoas muscles and some other things that function as primary muscles for different people. But not just knowing the names, what we really need to know is what that does and what the symptoms are of efficient and effective use of those muscles. Do we need to know the names and functions of secondary respiratory muscles and symptoms of dysfunction? Do we really need to know about the serratus posterior inferior, or is it sufficient to know about the quadratus lumborum? How about the intrinsic and extrinsic laryngeal muscles and their symptoms of disorder? Most of us would probably think that's a really good idea. And then, of course, there are articulators, innervation, circulation, neurology, health, hygiene, postural, brain, thought, you name it. We can go on forever and ever here. And physiology, do we need to know Feldenkrais? Do we need to know Alexander technique or some other thing, yoga? All of these things, there's so much that we could know about anatomy and physiology. Where do we stop and when is it enough? Is it sufficient to know, and that image is my big picture image, the big picture facts about respiration? How is a singer helped by telling her to engage only her transverse abdominis muscles? That's a good question. And it's actually a relevant question because a few years ago, I heard a study presented at the Voice Foundation that looked at the impact of isolated training of the transverse abdominis muscle in singers. And as proof of the efficacy, the people doing the study used surface electromyography. Science! The problem is you can't use surface electromyography to measure a muscle's work that is the third muscle down in the sandwich or even the fourth in some places. And we probably can't independently control just that one anyhow. Big picture facts about phonation. How is a singer actually helped by telling her to engage more TA contraction? Thyroarytenoid. Well, that might be exactly what she needs to do to strengthen her bottom voice. Or she may need to contract her cricothyroid muscle more strongly for her high pitches. But I defy you to do that voluntarily. Send a signal down right now to that cricothyroid muscle and say, contract, damn it, I need to sing higher, contract more. It ain't gonna work that way. Big picture facts about articulation. How is a singer helped by an instruction to contract her levator palatini muscle or to release her styloglossus? I would say in these three cases, we have instruction that might be 100% accurate, while at the same time being almost 100% useless. So what can we actually control? We have things that we can control, we've got things that we can influence, and we have things that are really hard, bearing on it, nearly impossible to control. So let's look at some easy things that are under our control. It's pretty easy for singers to learn to contract and release abdominal muscles, thoracic muscles, and for some, even pelvic muscles. I think it is generally easier for women to access their pelvic muscles for breathing than it is for men, and that is simply due to the anatomical fact that the opening in the female pelvis is significantly larger than the opening at the floor of the male pelvis. And there's good reason for that. Men don't need to push out babies. Therefore, they don't need to have a pelvis that is as big. More difficult for many singers, elevation of the soft palate. How many of you have trouble with that? Yeah, if you're truthful about it, many of you will experience some trouble with that at some point in your life. And yet, elevation of the soft palate is one of the simplest things that we ever do. Make the sound for me. Okay, now, how about a tongue trill? Okay, now, here's your challenge. Do a nasal tongue trill. Can anybody do it? No, you can't. It is physiologically impossible. Why? Because your palate is doing its job of closing the nasal port. That's all it's there for. It's a small movement, and we do it all the time. We do it every time we swallow. It has to go up, or what we're swallowing is going to head out our nose rather than down into our esophagus. For some of us, we have difficulty with that. Release of excess tongue and jaw tension. Has anybody listening ever not been in a lesson at some point in your life, and it might have only been one lesson, where your teacher told you to relax your tongue and jaw because they were too tight? Yeah, that's a really helpful instruction, isn't it? So I guarantee you that if you sing something, and I hear that your tongue is in just a little ball of tense muscle, and I say, your tongue is really tight. Will you do that again for me and just completely relax your tongue this time? What's going to happen? On the next attempt, the tongue is going to be tighter than ever. So that can be really tricky. And then elevation, depression of the larynx. I don't know right now how many of you are listening at this very moment, but I would bet that there are several of you who are still having issues with where your larynx sits in your throat while you are singing. It may be that it goes up when you are singing higher and you don't want it to do that. Now, it might be elevated while you were singing because that's a good thing to happen in some kinds of belting and commercial music. And it might be overly depressed, so you've got a sound. But what we do in those cases is really out of our voluntary control. And we need to take over voluntary control. I'm one of those rare teachers, perhaps, who does not object to telling a singer, and I don't care if it's a soprano or a tenor or what, that high note is going to work better if you will deliberately drop your larynx a few millimeters. That's just a little bit, but it's enough to elongate the vocal tract so that the interaction between formants and harmonics might occur in a more beneficial manner. Now, we've got some things that are harder to control, and for some, they seem to be impossible to master. And actually, I've had a good number of students over the years who found it impossible to master voluntary control of the soft palate. And for their entire lives, they sang, "Come on, ya man." And that resonance feels so good when you do it. Just feels like you are doing the most resonant voice possible. But no, you're just singing a nasally, obnoxious tone. So what are harder? Well, for a lot of people, the action of the diaphragm during exhalation is really tough. We say in opoggio breathing that we need to have muscular antagonism to resist the outflow of air and to regulate its air pressure. And part of the way that we do that is through the diaphragm. And singers, oftentimes, but not always, are able to learn deliberate control of the diaphragm. And like the soft palate, this is actually something that we do all the time. Put your hand in your on your epigastrium. So somewhere right between your belly button and the bottom of your ribs. And simply make the sound s, 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 s. What did you feel happen in that area where your hand is? I'm hoping that every one of you felt a little bit of an outward thrust every time you made the hissing sound. And that is because the diaphragm is engaging during the exhalation to help regulate the airflow. And so we just need to turn that from an automatic to a deliberate action. Action of the intrinsic laryngeal muscles. We do this routinely and reflexively. I can make you contract your TA muscles right now. Do not sing, but imagine a descending scale. If you are really conscientious about it, you will be able to feel your larynx changing as pitch goes down as the result of the thyroarytenoid muscle contracting. Or if you sing an ascending scale, again, you'll feel a change in your larynx as the cricothyroid muscle contracts. But that is on a general level. We do not have the ability to consciously tell our laryngeal muscles that you need to exert this much of stretch resistance to create this pitch. It's just really big picture at all. So in my pedagogical kingdom, or let's say more dictatorship, I would be happy if all teachers knew the difference between physiologic fact and fantasy. There are no alternative facts. There is truth and there is fiction. And in terms of what the body does and what resonance does, we need to deal in facts, not in fiction. I wish that all teachers understood that quality singing requires more than just great breath support. And let's see, so breath support. Breath is the power source of our voice, right? And with your car, the power source is the gasoline that powers the engine. We could say that the gas and the engine are like the breath and the vibrating vocal folds in the singer. You would be really upset if you took your car to a mechanic and complained that it was pulling violently to the right every time you touched the brakes. And your mechanic said, well, I suspect you really just need to run a couple of tanks of premium through it, and then it'll be all better. Gonna fix the source. No, sometimes you need to do a front end alignment. And sometimes you need to adjust the specific function that is going on, not trying to do it all through the back door of breath. That all teachers truly understood the difference between things under our direct versus our indirect control. And finally, that all teachers knew enough about voice disorders to make informed decisions about when to refer. Informed decisions. We have a couple of types, or several types of teachers out here in terms of what they hear or think they hear with voice disorders. We have some who assume that any little thing that is going on is a disorder and immediately send the student to the laryngologist. And then we have the teachers who think that they can solve and fix everything and virtually never send a student to the doctor. The really good, educated, and well-trained teachers become really pretty competent at listening to a voice and seeing what the singer is doing and understanding if the problem that you are hearing is based on technique and function or if it is based on a physiologic aberration that needs medical attention. Sound and resonance. This will be a quick test. True or false? The singer's formant is required for projection over an orchestra when singing without amplification, especially for tenors and baritones. Without amplification. True or false? Well, it's true, of course, right? Nah. Here's a power spectrum of Kraris and Krauss singing the high B in the Duke's aria from Rigoletto. Sorry, I lost it. And you see that F2 is just picking up the third harmonic here at about 1400 hertz for Carreras. Whereas with Krauss, there are three harmonics that are being strongly boosted, numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, which is a traditional singer's formant. This is a non-traditional singer's formant. This harmonic actually corresponds pretty closely to the high F natural that the Queen of the Night sings in her arias. And that alone is high enough in pitch to make it carry. So this answer is false. The singer's formant is not required for projection. Well, these are too hard. We're going to skip those. And look at what we can control. You haven't had my class yet. You've read my book, but we'll see. What can we control? Resonance. You know, we can control the interaction of pitch and vowel and vocal tract length. We can modify pitch obviously we can modify pitch to sing different pitches, but more importantly, we can tweak vowel sounds and the length of our vocal tract to make the resonance best suit a pitch that we are singing. Now, I'm wagering that most of you have worked with a student, or perhaps know a student, or maybe even sometime in your ancient history did something like this. Where you have one vowel that doesn't match. It goes fuzzy, it goes out of tune. And of course, being a good voice teacher, what do we need to fix? Ref support. For some reason, you are supporting your E, A, O, and U. You just forget to support the A. Nonsense. That note isn't working on that vowel because you've mistuned the resonance. We can control the optimal vowel selection for pitch, registration, efficiency, and intonation. Now, what do I mean by that? Can we really select the vowel? Well, you know, if you're a baritone and you're singing down below middle C, the composer tells you what vowel to sing. And you may need to tweak it ever so slightly. Your A vowel might need to be a little more closed or a little bit more open on a specific pitch to get optimal resonance. But if you are a female or a countertenor, or even a tenor at the very top of the range, there are times when you simply need to select an alternate vowel and abandon the vowel that appears in the text. I defy any of you to hear the difference if a soprano is singing the word heat at the pitch E5 versus the word hate. They are going to sound identical, but hate is going to be infinitely easier to sing than heat. So change it, sing hate. The tuning of the vocal tract for best sound, so that we are really adept at moving our palate and our tongue and our jaw so that we can get to an efficient sound. Now, ultimately, we're not going to do that by thinking, okay, I am going to tune my vocal tract now. No. When we are studying, we learn sounds that are made when our vocal tract is tuned in a specific way. And then we simply need to recreate those sounds. So if you're talking about being a singer, you don't really need to know much about any of these things. As long as your teacher is good, it can tell you what sounds better and what is working optimally and efficiently. So if we go back to anatomy and physiology, remember we have a few specific muscles, otherwise big picture things. So I would be happy if teachers understood formants and their significance for singing and language. Feel pretty comfortable with that at this point after you've had your voice science classes? I hope so. The teachers could think in 3 dimensions, immediately seeing, hearing, and predicting the intersections of harmonics and formants, so that you know if a singer is ascending a scale on a certain vowel, at a certain place in that vowel, all of a sudden it's going to be like stepping into the spotlight on stage, except it's an acoustic spotlight, and the sound of the pitch is going to improve dramatically as the harmonics and formants coincide. And the teachers understood that defects in tone are as likely to result from poor resonance tuning as from poor breath management or improper phonation. Those are 3 pretty big things. Remember, all problems are not pathologies. Sometimes it's just bad technique. But is it possible that there simply is too much to learn to more than scratch the surface of an entire graduate pedagogy or singing health curriculum, let alone in a single course? And there are, at the undergraduate level, there are a lot of schools that maybe devote what part of one semester to voice science. Now, but if we're thinking about all of this, is it really possible to be a good teacher if you don't know your own voice, or you don't know what really fine singing sounds like? I can't tell you the number of times I've gone to NATS competitions and had a teacher from a school who is, not a terribly experienced person, who maybe taught for a while, but has sung mostly parochially and not been really in contact with real singers. And they come in and we have a singer who would be a really lovely Despina, or maybe perhaps a Zerlina, and instead she is singing Dich teure Halle, a young dramatic aria, because she's the loudest singer this teacher has had in several years. Well, guess what? Good singers are loud. That doesn't mean that you have a big voice. So we need to know that. And can we trust that the required ancillary skills are acquired in work with others? As a singing teacher, we're just going to accept that the song survey classes are going to take care of everything, and that they're going to learn everything that they need to learn about stage deportment in their opera workshop classes, and that they're going to get their diction from their diction teacher, and that they're going to get their musicianship from their coach, and all we need to do is teach them how to make good noise, and then everybody else can take over and turn it into beautiful music. Well, we got a lot of teachers who work that way. I can't work that way. If we're with my singers, if you're not making music and engaging me in something that speaks to my spirit, I don't want to hear it. I'm not interested in just beautiful sounds. You must be able to translate those beautiful sounds into expression. And so, might it be that the more we can work through that expression to reinforce technique, the better it will be, and the more optimal the singing will be. So I've got a final thought here for you. I would say that science impacts or informs almost every decision I make in a lesson, but so do an awful lot of other things. I started studying the piano when I was age 4, and by the time I was a senior in high school, I played a solo recital with the Beethoven Opus 47, the Passionatus Sonata, and not Brahms, the Chopin something in G minor. It's hard, a big Debussy piece, and I finished. I did my undergraduate degree in piano, but somewhere along there, I had to start accompanying for singers, and I decided that I sang almost as well as many of those, so maybe I should take some voice lessons. I auditioned for voice lessons and became a voice major and a piano major. And that was great because I was going to be a conductor. And my conducting training was probably, with my piano training, the most important thing in all of my musical training. And that's because it forced me to understand the music as a whole, the way every part interacts with every other part. In singing, how many times have you had a student come in for a lesson, or have you gone into a lesson where you have studied diligently in the practice room and you think you are doing absolutely everything right when you are in the practice room? You're learning a new song, and then you get to your lesson and do it with a pianist for the first time and discover that you actually learned in a whole bunch of wrong notes and wrong rhythms, because when you weren't doing it with the accompaniment, you couldn't tell that it was wrong. Everything sounds right if there's no accompaniment. My language study, my literature study, not music literature, just literature. All of the time I've spent on stage and all of the singers with whom I have shared the stage. I'm affected by every jury that I have ever listened to, every audition that I have ever listened to. When you put all of that together, it is just really more than is reasonable to expect any one person to do. It's sort of a Faustian bargain. We can't know everything. And it's a good thing we can't, because if we spent our lives trying to know everything before we start to do anything, we will never get to do anything. And yes, when you first begin teaching, even if you are teaching young professional singers, you're going to say a lot of dumb stuff. And you are going to give a lot of poor instructions, and you're going to screw up some people. But as the years pass, you will get better and better at your diagnostic skills, and you will get better and better at correcting the thing that is actually the issue. And you will get to the point where you can listen to a singer and realize that if this little change were made, the sound would change in this manner. And then you can give your instruction, and you will discover that you become really good at knowing exactly what's going to happen when you make that correction. And if you are a really good teacher, you don't just know what's going to happen after you make that one correction, but you know what's going to happen 6 corrections down the line, and all of the things that need to be different to transform this singer from one who is really quite good to one who has serious professional possibilities. So we need to know enough about science to help us become the best singers that we can. Well, we realize that it is not the solution to everything. Questions?
All right. Scott, thank you so much. Everyone watching, please feel free to either raise your hand or submit a question to me, and I can ask our guest. As we wait for those to come in, I'll ask you, Scott, first of all, had some flashbacks during your presentation, worried I was being tested personally. I found myself, especially directly after my doctorate, I think sometimes falling into the trap of speaking to utilizing anatomical language maybe more than was helpful, or using more detail in description of the acoustics than was necessary. How have you found that balance of knowing it, but without necessarily imparting it directly to the student?
This is a part of my teaching that I think surprises a lot of people. When I am teaching, as I said, science informs just about everything I do, but I almost always do my dead level best to conceal that from the student with whom I am working, unless it is a graduate student who is currently engaged in work in voice science, and that we have just recently been talking about a specific element of either physiology or acoustics that is relevant to the specific thing that we are now working on in the lesson. And in those cases, I will reinforce the generalized instruction with something that is more specific, just to help the singer understand why we talked about that in the voice science class.
Mm-hmm.
I have a voice lab right outside my door.
Mm-hmm.
I almost never take somebody in there to sing.
Mm-hmm. Another issue, so we're actually in my pedagogy class I'm teaching right now. Uh, we are actually in discussions about formants and acoustics. That's where we're at in our discussion. And I was wondering, how long does it take you, and do you ever use the laboratory equipment to determine, formant frequency locations can vary by, a third in either direction based on, as opposed to what we kind of use as our general guideline. Do you try to determine those for the singer based on your interactions, or do you utilize acoustic analysis software to kind of try to locate those locations?
Uh, my friend Ken Bozeman, who many of you know or have heard presentations by, said something that was absolutely brilliant in his most recent book, Practical Voice Acoustics. And that is that a teacher who cannot make the correct acoustic adjustments by ear
Mm-hmm.
almost certainly will not be able to make them using technology either. And no, I don't go into the lab to figure out where the formants are because you can hear it.
Mm-hmm.
You can hear when the specific pitch on a vowel really comes into focus and shines more brightly than its neighbors. And then you can use that information. And again, you know, I call this oftentimes teaching from what's good. Rather than trying to fix problems, try to make the stuff that works better work over a larger range of pitches. So you
Mm-hmm.
find that pitch where there is clearly a good interaction between the formant and a harmonic or the fundamental, and then you figure out what you need to do to go above and go below to maintain as similar a quality as you can, but realizing that probably there will only be one or two pitches, a half step apart, that
Mm-hmm.
have that absolutely optimal quality.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like equal temperament tuning on a keyboard instrument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I asked because my students, a couple of them were asking about that. They say, so should I sing into, Voce Vista or something like that to try to figure out where those are? And trying to stress to them that no, your teacher and you yourself can feel where those vowels ring without the benefit of the.
Yep,
It's great to visualize it. It's great to kind of get a sense for it visually, but that's more of a supplemental source of feedback rather than the primary source of feedback.
it is. And I think that it is vital for teachers to have that experience of watching things as they are analyzed so that we can start to draw neural connections between what we know intellectually and what we hear. And that image that we see of the analysis oftentimes can be a trigger for making that connection.
Another question I would ask is a lot of a lot of people out there who are teaching voice right now either went to school quite a while ago or maybe had pedagogy classes that utilized older textbooks, maybe feel a little disconnected from some of these concepts we're discussing. How do you recommend teachers who don't feel comfortable with some of this some of this terminology, some of the acoustic concepts we're discussing? How do you recommend them kind of dipping their toe into the water, starting to either refamiliarize themselves with this information or to get a cursory understanding of it?
Small pieces,
Mm-hmm.
small bites. Um, so most of you are pretty competent using a word processor at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're pretty competent using things like PowerPoint, and maybe that extends to things like Excel. And if you're more geeky, maybe it goes to Photoshop and all of those kinds of things. Or building your own website. Let's say you're going to build a website with Dreamweaver. And so the first thing that you're going to do, of course, is to go buy 4 big manuals for Dreamweaver, each of which is about this thick.
Mm-hmm.
And you are going to study all 4 of those volumes from cover to cover and learn everything you can possibly do before you open the program for the first time. No. Same thing with Word. You probably spent a long time always clicking on the bold button to change text to bold before you finally got it into your mind that, well, it's really easier if I use Control or Command B to make it bold. I can keep my hand on the keyboard. My goodness. And so we acquire these things, which are highly technical
Hmm.
and really complicated, bit by bit. And when you start typing your first letter, you don't use bold, you don't
Hmm.
use italics. And then when you get to something there you really need to do it, you find out how. And the same thing can be true here. That, yes, if your goal is to learn everything that you possibly can learn at the moment about anatomy and physiology, and now about learning science and how the brain works and how we acquire new information and acoustics and all of that, before we do anything, we'll never be able to get started.
Hmm.
Realize that we know something, and that then we can keep enhancing what we know as our lives develop as artist teachers.
That's excellent. Conversely, what do you say to those people whose answer lined up with answer number one at the beginning of your presentation? People for hundreds of years learned how to sing, sang the great masterpieces in the operatic repertoire without
Hmm?
any of this knowledge. It's not necessary. It just gets in the way. What would you say to those people to kind of lure them over to the dark side with us?
Actually, I wouldn't say anything to try to lure them if they are producing good results.
Hmm.
If their students are singing well and they are getting work and they are singing in a healthful manner that allows them to sing for extended periods without fatiguing or injury, then that teacher is doing her job. She
Hmm.
doesn't need to know all of the formants and everything else because she's producing good singers through alternative means.
Right.
Where I think it becomes really important is for the teachers who don't have that gift of
Hmm.
just being able to say, if you will just tweak this note with a little bit more feeling of blue,
Hmm.
sometimes that works really well. But if it isn't, then you need to have the backup. And I think the science really helps you with backup.
Right.
And also, I think most of those teachers now who are turning out really wonderful singers who know nothing about science are able to turn out really fine singers because they started out as really fine singers
Hmm.
and only needed a little tweak and a pat here and there
Right.
to become even better singers.
Right. And I think there's something to be said about intuitively understanding. Just like we said, we don't march our students into the lab. If we hear that ring
Hmm.
on certain vowels, we're able to recreate it. We find that success and extend it.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really good advice. We don't have any more questions from our audience right now. But I would love to tell people who are listening or people who are watching the archived video later. I mentioned the third edition of your book. Are there any other things that you're up to that you'd like to tell people where they can read more about what you're doing?
Yep. There will be a revised version of Your Voice, the Basics, coming out by the first of the year, we hope.
Oh, great.
We'll actually have its title tweaked a little bit, and it will now be called The Basics or Basics of Voice Science and Pedagogy. And there'll be an asterisk that says formerly Your Voice, the Basics, simply because people were having trouble keeping them straight
Right.
and ordering the wrong book because the titles were too similar. But like we did with Inside View, images will now be in color,
Hmm.
and there will be things that are tweaked to update them to a little bit more of contemporary information.
Hmm.
And then next year, when I am retired, I am planning to get started on a new book that will combine the classical elements of Your Voice, which, those of you who are familiar with those two textbooks know that it is geared primarily toward classical singing.
Hmm.
And my goal is to find somebody who is a very competent and very informed teacher of contemporary music, and then have that person add comments and application things for each chapter to show how this might be applicable to the other side of the world.
Hmm.
And we need to acknowledge that the other side of the world is where most singers live at this point.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll just also plug, we use your book in our pedagogy class here at Utah State. And a lot of our students who are using the ebook are really, really enjoying that experience too. So, little plug there.
Yeah,
Well, Scott, thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us and for
you're
sharing
welcome.
this information. It's been a pleasure getting to catch up with you and and hear your take on this subject. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and thanks again to Scott. We'll end the broadcast now. Take care.
Good evening, everybody.